Okay.
I'll do questions for you. So if I write names over here. people know.
Okay. You're gonna write them down. Are we good to go? So, okay. We'll start the meeting. This is the Legislative Audit Commission, the Audit Subcommittee. Today is November 14th. It's 10 a.m. We have in attendance, myself, Representative Quam, Senator Cran, and then online, we have
Representative Lee,
Representative Lee,
Jacob,
Representative Jacob, Zhang,
Senator Barr,
and Senator Barr.
and I believe Representative Hanson is on his way in.
All right, we're expecting Representative Hanson shortly. All right, and all right, today we have two audits we'll be reviewing. The first is the Minnesota State Academies for the Deaf and Blind. And we have to present from the Office of the Legislative Auditor, Lori Lyson and Jordan, is it Bionfeld? Right? Hey, there we go. All right, so I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, and for the record, my name is Lori Lyson. I'm the Deputy Legislative Auditor for the Financial Audit Division at the Office of the Legislative Auditor. So this morning, you're gonna hear about two very different reports. We have one that focuses on financial operations, and then the other one focuses on information technology. And these reports have two very different outcomes. One has an overall positive conclusion, where the other one has a substantial number of findings. So for this first audit, we conducted an audit of the Minnesota State Academies for the Deaf and the Blind. This was a performance audit that looked at the financial operations throughout the academies. And we reviewed the academy's oversights of its two site councils, its two affiliated foundations. We also did work on payroll, non-payroll, and receipts. And then we also determined whether or not the academies resolved prior audit findings from our 2013 performance audit. So the results of the current audit produced 12 findings, and it really hit on all areas that we tested. And our conclusion is that the academies did not comply with finance-related legal requirements, and they did not have adequate internal controls. So I'm going to turn the presentation over to Mr. Bionfall, who will discuss our audit and the report in more detail. Thank you.
Madam
Mr.
Chair,
Bianco.
Commission
Thank you.
members. My name is Jordan Bionfold. I'm an audit director with the Office of the Legislative Auditor. And today I'll be presenting the results of our performance audit of the Minnesota State Academies for the Deaf and the Blind. First, I'd like to recognize the other members of the audit team, including Joey Anderson, Ellie Gruber, Andrea Hess, Crystal Nibby, and Emily Wyant. The Minnesota State Academies, or MSA, consist of two schools, the Academy for the Deaf and the Academy for the Blind. The academies provide education and other services to students who are blind, visually impaired, deaf, or hard of hearing. The students range from early childhood up through age 21. In the latest school year, the Academy for the Deaf enrolled 85 students, and the Academy for the Blind enrolled 45 students. The majority of the students are Minnesota residents. However, the academies do
He is on mute. We cannot hear Jordan at this time.
Joined us.
Thank you.
Representative Hanson is online,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Anyone else?
Senator Zhang.
Thank you. Okay. Would you like to start over? Thanks. Thanks.
Sure.
Madam Chair, committee members, for the record, my name is Jordan Beyondfold. I'm an audit director with the Office of the Legislative Auditor. I'll be presenting the results of our performance audit of the Minnesota State Academies for the deaf and the blind. I'd like to recognize the other members of the audit team, Joey Anderson, Ellie Gruber, Andrea Hess, Crystal Nibby, and Emily Wyant. An overview of the Minnesota State Academies, or MSA. MSA consists of two schools, the State Academy for the Deaf and the State Academy for the Blind. The academies provide education and other services to students who are deaf, hard of hearing, blind, or visually impaired. In the latest school year, the Academy for the Deaf enrolled 85 students and the Academy for the Blind enrolled 45 students. The majority of the students are Minnesota residents. However, the academies do enroll some students from out of state. And about 40% of students live on campus in the dormitories. The academies are overseen by a governing board consisting of 7 members appointed by the governor and by 2 ex officio members appointed by the school's site councils. So the board has established 2 site councils, one for each school, and these site councils consist of MSA staff, students, parents, or other stakeholders in the school. The objectives of our audit were to determine if MSA had adequate internal controls and complied with significant legal requirements and resolved prior audit findings. Our audit covered the period from July 1st, 2021 through December 31st of 2023. And during this audit period, MSA received general fund appropriations totaling about $46 million. And then they also collected receipts totaling about $10 million. The majority of these receipts are reimbursements from the Department of Education. They also collect some donations from individuals. They collect tuition from out-of-state students, and they collect some activity fees for things like sports or after-school clubs. And then MSA, about 84% of their expenditures during our audit period were for payroll, and about 16% were for non-payroll. So our audit covered 4 main areas: the oversight of the academies and some of the funding sources used. And then we tested payroll and non-payroll expenditures, and we reviewed the receipts collected by the academies. Our overall conclusion was that MSA generally did not comply with significant legal requirements and generally did not have adequate internal controls. And we identified 12 findings across all of our audit areas. And I will go over a few select findings today. The first finding on page 12 of your report is that the MSA site councils did not meet in accordance with their bylaws. The bylaws require monthly meetings during the school year, which comes out to 9 meetings for each site council. And then during the first 2 years of our audit period, they did cancel several meetings because the site councils did not meet the quorum. And rather than meet without a quorum, they decided to cancel these meetings. And then prior to the 23-24 school year, the MSA governing board decided to cancel all of the site council meetings. During this time, the board reviewed the bylaws and revised these bylaws to try to make it easier for the site councils to meet quorum. However, during this time period, the site councils did not meet and did not even attempt to meet the quorum. And the purpose of these site councils is to give the stakeholders in the school, such as students or parents, an opportunity to provide formal feedback and formal recommendations to the board. And while they could still provide public comment at the general board meeting, they did not have the opportunity to provide this more formal feedback through the site councils because they were canceled. And our recommendation was that the governing board should ensure that these site councils are meeting in accordance with their bylaws. We also had a finding that MSA did not monitor the financial statements or the fundraising activities of its affiliated foundations. This was a prior audit finding from our last report of MSA, which came out in 2013. And so each school has its own affiliated foundation. These foundations are separate legal entities. However, they were created for the purpose of raising money on behalf of the academies and its students. MSA contracts with each foundation and requires the foundations to provide annual financial statements and annual statements on their fundraising activities. During our audit period, MSA did not obtain and review those reports. And then we also identified some other issues with the foundations. The first was that the School for the Deaf Foundation was actually inactive during a good portion of our audit from 2020 through 2023. During this time period, the foundation was not raising money, was not distributing money. They did have a balance of about $45,000 that sat idle in a bank account. And then it wasn't until 2023 when some new board members decided to reestablish this foundation that money was transferred over to the new board members. And then we found that both the School for the Deaf Foundation and the School for the Blind Foundation did not always properly file or register with the Attorney General's office or the Office of the Secretary of State. And our recommendation is that MSA should monitor the activity of its affiliated foundations as required by its contracts. We do have two findings in the report related to the superintendent's travel. The first is that the superintendent approves his own travel. And so this is an internal control issue that we identified by having a single individual approve their own travel. MSA is at a higher risk of paying for travel that either does not comply with state policy or is not in the best interest of the state. And in finding 6, we did identify that MSA did not always comply with state policy when paying for the superintendent's travel. We identified issues related to 3 out-of-state trips taken to attend conferences or board meetings. We identified a number of issues with those trips, including inadequate documentation. So MSA did not retain agendas of the conferences to support the business purpose for these trips. We identified some discrepancies between the travel authorization forms and the travel that actually occurred. And then we identified that the state did pay for some personal travel. Exhibit 6 in the report outlines some of these discrepancies that we identified. So the orange line in this exhibit, this represents the travel as it was listed on this MSA's authorization form. The form listed that the superintendent would attend a board meeting in Utah and then fly to Connecticut for a leadership retreat and then fly back to Utah for a conference before finally returning to Minnesota. MSA did not have documentation of these agendas stored with the approval forms to show that they had reviewed and approved these trips and verify the purpose at the time. We were able to later obtain agendas either from MSA or by searching online to find the conference agendas. And so the green lines represent what we were able to verify. And so we were able to verify that there was a board meeting and conference in Utah during the week of November 6th. And then there was a leadership retreat in Connecticut during the week of November 19th. However, then we identified that the superintendent then flew back to Utah and took personal vacation and holiday leave during the week of November 27th. And so there was no business purpose for him to travel back to Utah. And so we did identify that as personal travel that was paid for by the state. We do have several recommendations related to these 2 travel findings. First is that MSA should require someone other than the superintendent to approve his travel to create a separation of duties. MSA should collect any money any state money that was paid for personal travel. And MSA should strengthen their internal controls to ensure that they are complying with state policy when paying for travel. On page 19 of the report, we do have one finding related to payroll. We identified several issues. One that I'll highlight is we tested over 11,000 timesheets that were completed during our audit scope, and about 36% of these timesheets were completed by the supervisor or by the payroll department rather than by the employee themselves. We also identified that MSA did not conduct a complete inventory during our audit period. We reviewed their inventory documentation and we reviewed some of their inventory on site, and we did identify some assets that were recorded on their inventory records but did not exist on site. And we identified some assets on site that were not recorded in their inventory records. And then we also did identify two findings related to the lack of documentation for purchase approvals. And finally, we did have 4 findings related to the area of receipts. I'll highlight these last 2 bullets. So MSA does provide health services to its students. And when those students are enrolled in medical assistance, MSA submits those claims to DHS and then is reimbursed from Medicaid funding. We found that MSA did not always document a reconciliation between the claims that they had submitted and the reimbursements that they had received from DHS. And similarly, MSA reports certain expenditures related to one-on-one services. They report those to the Department of Education, and the Department of Education reimburses MSA from special education funding. We identified that during our audit period, MSA overreported their expenditures by about $31,000 and were then reimbursed for more than they should have been because of the overreporting. That concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions?
Thank
Sorry,
you,
we-
and I
Sorry.
apologize
Yeah,
for being tardy. One of the observations I think over time that we have found is in terms of internal controls is they are especially although there seems here to be some basic patterns, but nevertheless, that they are particularly challenging in small agencies where to have separation of duties, et cetera, is more of a challenge than in larger organizations. And I was trying to quickly see here whether or what the size of the of the organization of the 2 academies are. I mean, they are very small. The enrollment is very small. It's dropped off in the last few years significantly, and wondered in your recommendations, and this is true, Ms. Lyson, for other small agencies, and we do have some that work very effectively. But do you develop like a set of recommendations for small agencies like this one, so that they can do the best they can to avoid these kinds of of findings. When, they were, you know, not, not, not particularly, I mean, they're not trying to be careless with some of the requirements, but that other things were getting in the way of their compliance. And with this report, of course, there were, and thank you very much, sir, there were any number of instances of noncompliance. But when you work with small agencies that maybe have as few as 10 or 11 employees, do you make recommendations for them for the future? And do you, how do you go about making sure that they understand everything that is needed for them to comply with the statutes or regulations and their responsibilities, in particular to MMB?
Thank you. Deputy Auditor Lyson.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair and Senator Rust. So for the state academies, there is 190 staff. So we do feel like there is a sufficient number of staff to comply and have that separation of duties. But you are correct that there are a lot of state entities that are small. Our office included is a smaller office, and we have to look to ways to make sure that we have strong internal controls. So although we do understand the complications and the struggles to separate duties, we still believe it's possible even in the smallest entity. I have a really good example of that. We did a judicial audit years ago, and different courthouses actually maybe only had one administrator at the courthouse, and they would use somebody from a completely different location to help with that separation of duties. So I would say our recommendations do not change, but our understanding of the struggle to try to ensure that separation of duties, we can acknowledge, and we can help them identify ways that we've seen other state entities accomplish this in small settings. And then we also know that Minnesota has SMART. I am not remembering what SMART stands for right now, but it is an entity, a state entity that can provide HR and payroll services for smaller state entities.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Follow up. Okay. Senator Curran.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So on the, it's page 10 of the superintendent travel of the presentation. So it looks like this person approves all their travel. And then what is the process? What should the process have looked like for their internal controls with the superintendent? Was that something that oversight the chair of the board? What would be the traditional process for that to make sure that we do have the good business practices? I don't see it called out in here besides all procedures. But what is that? What should that good what is the existing law that drives them, and what should that process look like so we don't have individuals approving their own without any oversight?
Director Bonfed.
Madam Chair and Senator Cran, the MSA does have other controls for other travel taken by other entities where they have a training coordinator who approves things like attending conferences and other trainings. And they have an authorization form that is then approved by multiple people. And that documentation then goes to finance, who should review and review those conference agendas and things like that prior to booking the travel or prior to making the payment. What we found with the superintendent was some of those controls seemed to have been bypassed, and the superintendent was completing the travel authorization form himself and approving his own travel. So they were bypassing some of the established controls they did have in place.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you. And so with the travel then identified for the superintendent where we were intermingled personal, what was the total amount of that trip And then was the personal piece that he didn't repay or that approved unjustly, was it just airfare? Was it hotels? Was it meals and other expenses? What are those types of things that were then paid for by the taxpayers for their own personal travel? What was the total dollar amount?
Director Bronfeld, Bronfeld, can you
Madam Chair, beyond fold.
be on phone?
Beyond.
Okay.
Madam Chair, members, the specific trip that I identified in Exhibit 6, that trip was about $1,600 in total. I don't have the overall amount of travel, but I can confirm we did review all expenditures related to this travel and looked to see, did MSA pay for any hotels or pay for any meal reimbursements or anything like that during the time periods where he was either on vacation or not traveling, but not specifically there for a conference. And we did not identify any hotel purchases or hotel stays that were inappropriate. We did identify $56 related to meal reimbursements. And these were meals that were taken while he was traveling for personal reasons. But other than that, that $56, and then we did identify the 2 flights. Those came, the flight to Utah and then the flight back to Minnesota. Those totaled about $600. And so what we don't have is the cost of what it would have taken to fly from Connecticut to Minnesota. And what MSA should have done under state policy was document what that price is. And then if it was higher than what they incurred, or if they incurred more than that cost, then the superintendent should have paid the difference.
Thank you.
One last question.
Senator Kern?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for that answer. And then on page 12 of your presentation, other findings in the oversight of payroll. So it looks like there's no oversight. And then when we look at 36%, almost 40% of the timesheets completed by somebody other than the employee. One, I mean, they're major holes here well, it doesn't appear to be any oversight. But in that case, then, what comfort do we have in knowing that those employees were not underpaid or overpaid for the particular time period? That's a pretty significant number over in just even a calendar year, more or less, multiple years. And were all of the those prepared by the superintendent or the supervisors, not superintendent, sorry, or finance, were those just for standard 40-hour work weeks or whatever the standard work week was? Or were there any variations, or did you look through those to see if there's any conflict or any anomalies that stood up?
Director Bionfeld?
Madam Chair and Senator Cran, we did test premium payments such as overtime or on-call pay, shift differential, those types of payments where staff are receiving more than their traditional 80 hours of work. So we do have some assurance that those payments were made correctly. With the finding regarding the supervisors completing timesheets for the employees, what the concern here is the employees are the best people who know what they worked on. And the concern is supervisors then could be going in and changing things, adding hours, reducing hours. They could change vacation leave to regular work hours. They could, if a staff is part-time and they work 40 hours instead of 80 hours, the supervisors could change that amount. We did not get into the specific details of those types of situations. We focus our testing on the control of testing the timesheet approval, which would prevent the risk of those types of situations occurring.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Representative Quam?
Thank you, Madam Chair. what comes to mind is every audit that's presented, there are policies, procedures, and et cetera that aren't implemented. Is there a process for communicating to similar organizations findings of, hey, this is a great implementation that you maybe want to plagiarize or copy? And- Well, it comes down to, if there are good findings, make sure that other entities within the state see what those are and maybe can improve their processes. And if there are errors or things that fell through the crack, that is also communicated so that they don't have to wait to be audited to see these type of activities. So and instead of being, you know, some of these are pretty hefty, a summarized list that was accessible and distributed. I'm trying to see if there's a better way to avoid repetition.
Director
Can
Bionfield or,
take a
yeah, Auditor Lyson.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Qualm. Yeah, that's an excellent idea. It's being proactive, right? Taking a proactive approach is always best. Minnesota Management and Budget does have a unit within their agency that tracks all of our findings from audits and evaluations and special reviews. So they are equipped to share that information with other state agencies within the executive branch. And they do have meetings, I'm going to call it an internal control roundtable meeting that meets regularly throughout the year that agencies can actually attend, and that this can be a discussion point. I have only attended one of those meetings. We were invited to attend one, Auditor Randall and myself, to explain kind of our role in state government. So I'm not quite sure what is on the agenda from time to time, but that would be the perfect environment to take that proactive approach and to share findings and to convey those to other state agencies. In addition, obviously, our website also has all of our reports on it. I would like to think that the Financial Audit Division can move towards summarizing that information at some point in the future. But right now, that's not something that's accessible other than through our reports. But again, that mechanism already exists within Minnesota Management and Budget.
Thank you. Any other further questions?
Madam Chair, I noticed that MMB is listed farther down on the agenda, and it might be good to touch upon that, you know, round of their practice. The other thing is SWIFT was brought up, and a lot of the smaller entities have personnel that are doing maybe a very, you know, every like 4 hours a month, or very intermittently, they're doing some processes, and it might be so intermittent that they get rusty at, or there are some things that get missed, so that if there's an entity of SWIFT that could have specialists available, so all of these low bandwidth utilizations could be off to somebody that they do that every day. They would recognize something, flags would pop up. That might be another thing for us and the OLA to have a discussion on, because I'm tired of repetitive things showing up during these audits, and we should be proactive. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you.
Thank you. Senator Dibble?
Thank you, Madam Chair. There was mention made earlier of a finding which was the same as a finding done in a previous audit. So effectively, no change from that previous audit. So my question is, if you could remind me, when that previous audit was done, was it as comprehensive as what we see in front of us today? And is it possible to track back and forth what improvements were made in response to that audit, and which one, and what improvements perhaps were not made and whether we're finding new issues that have cropped up. It seems like 12 findings is a lot and is kind of broad in their scope of practices that aren't quite up to the standards that the OLA would expect. So just a simple question, really. When was the previous audit done? And how many findings track into this audit?
Deputy Lyson or? Okay, go ahead.
Madam Chair, members, the prior audit report was released in 2013. And that report, I believe it had 7 findings. We did follow up on several of those findings and some of those were actually resolved. The only finding that was consistent between both reports was the monitoring of the foundations.
Thank you. Senator Dibble?
Thanks. So a follow-up question, sorry, it triggered a thought. Can any conclusions be drawn about general management practices and principles from the fact that 7 findings were discovered in the previous audit? One, of course, was not addressed as evidenced by this audit, and 12 more show up 10 or so years later.
Director Banfield? Or,
Take that.
okay. Deputy Lyson?
Thank you, Madam Chair and Senator Dibble. Sorry that we're going back and forth. I am careful to draw a conclusion, but I do think it's concerning that when we were there in 2013, there's 7 findings and now there's 12. That's not a great track record. I'm not going to say that in those, 10 plus years since we were there last, that maybe some improvements hadn't been made in those first years. And then those controls kind of fell away and then that non-compliance occurred. But it is extremely concerning when we have agencies that have that many findings. Again, the work that we do is looking at opportunities for employees to commit fraud, waste, and abuse, right? And without those internal controls and the look at both of these audits being what we consider a full scope. So the one in 2013 and the one now did test all that same stuff, payroll, non-payroll, and expenditures. And knowing that in both of those, we had findings in many areas, in Jordan's in particular, in all areas that we tested, it's concerning. And I think we can draw the conclusion that that's concerning. But I would hold back on saying that they had not improved at all. Because there is a period of time in that 10 years that maybe decisions were made and they had stronger controls. We don't know that though.
Senator Rest?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Excuse me. I too am concerned that there's a repeat finding. We never like to see them. And these 12 findings are different from the 6 that were resolved. What seems to me to be a picture here is an agency that is just continuing to struggle to meet its mission. It sometimes doesn't even get a quorum of its board to make a decision. And so I can understand kind of the disappointment of saying, well, if nobody's going to come, why do we even schedule a meeting and get the staff ready for that? And then I look at the time period, and it is smack dab right in the middle of the pandemic, and when lots of organizations were failing. And I'm impressed that the agencies accept all of your findings and have already started to comply. Wasn't clear to me in reading whether all of them have finished complying, but for example, they're going to hold meetings every month of their board, whether a quorum shows up or not. And that will mean that it's on the board to be there. They are gubernatorial appointees and they should be present in running this, these two educational institutions. And that they said in one response, part of one response that they're going to hold a meeting. And maybe, I think they said they were starting in August, that they, so that should mean they've had at least one or two. And if they don't achieve a quorum, that they will hold an informational meeting, but understanding that they can't take any action without a quorum. I would expect, and I wonder sometimes, Madam Chair, and I would think that Representative Hansen would remember this too, as well as perhaps Senator Coran, that we have in the past asked for an update. And I think in particular for a performance review like this, that it would be very appropriate for, say, an updated review to see whether these items have been complied with satisfactorily. And I don't mean another performance audit, but just checking the findings and are they doing the payroll correctly? Looks like they've changed the way in which the superintendent's travel is arranged and approved. And it's not the amount of money necessarily, but it certainly is the principle of responsibility and accountability. But I hope that your office will consider as part of their work plan a review of the two academies for a year from now to see whether perhaps the pandemic depression that so many of us experience in organizations has been corrected.
Thank you. Thank you.
Otherwise, Madam Chair, it's
Mhm.
totally unacceptable. I mean, absolutely and clearly unacceptable. But you might just consider a review because this is not a good report.
Thank you. And Senator Rest, I wholeheartedly agree. And I would bet that the entire audit commission feels the same way. Is there anyone else that has a question before we bring up the Minnesota State Academies? Anyone else? Okay, thank you. So I believe we have Superintendent Wildling online. Is that correct? And is Finance Director Miller here? No,
they
online
are.
also.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, are you together?
Yes, we're in the same conference room.
Superintendent, okay. All right. I'll turn it over to Superintendent Wildling. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. My name is Terry Wilding. I am the superintendent of the schools and also have Amber Miller, our finance director. She is with me here. Good morning. I do not have a lot to add to the recent presentation, but we do recognize that there are some areas where we need to make adjustments and improvements. Within those areas, we have already started to address within the conversations with the OLAs. In learning some of those findings, we've created new guidelines. We've already began applying some of those changes. And we will continue that work in different processes and procedures and policies, as well as trainings for our staff to meet all of those 12 findings. We do face some challenges with the system that is currently in place. As you mentioned, payroll. As the state system applies, MMB has set up that system. It doesn't necessarily match our daily operations as a school. We have different shifts, we have adjustments during the day, and we have students' individual education plans, which do require much more complicated documentation on those timesheets related to the comment section. As we analyze through each department, we are analyzing and trying to do more training for our staff and our supervisors to bring that up to par on what is expected by the state. Our system is not necessarily as flexible as we'd like it to be, in trying to figure out how we can mesh our system as a school with the state agency system. We are committed to meeting all of those expectations and making those improvements. We have not had an audit since 2013, so it's a good learning experience for us here, trying to iron out what we can do better. And having completed some of those safeguards as we work with the OLA office, we learned different things. In some of those, we have already met and completed those findings. Is there any questions for myself or Amber at this time?
Thank you, Superintendent. Any questions from members? Is there anyone online that has questions? I don't see any. Senator Coran?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Superintendent Wilding, I don't recall how long you've been a part of the, or serving in the role as superintendent.
Superintendent Wadley?
Sure, I had started in July of 2016.
Senator Coran?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so the processes or the findings in the report are mostly just good business practices. And so the good news is I didn't see any recommendations of change or lack of clarity in state statute in the ability to, or what your obligations are as a steward of public funds. And so I think the cautionary tale is you've been here for a long time and basic policies weren't followed. And so either something is wrong and we haven't heard any demands at the legislature that we need corrective action to allow you to function within the needs or to meet whatever your unique needs are within the school system. But this is a huge failure. It appears there's no controls in you and others have violated your own policies. And so I struggle to say, well, we found them. I appreciate it. It wasn't a hostile response and you at least acknowledge the findings of the auditor, but it's $40+ million under your responsibility or controls. And if we don't have, we're talking about the high level controls, not the outcome and the value of the product you actually deliver. So building confidence in our taxpayer base is not just, well, you didn't find anything wrong or there's a theft or we don't know because we really, this audit didn't go into, did you underpay employees, overpay employees? It doesn't even cover that. And so I always go into then this audit doesn't cover what you do and how you deliver what you're statutorily created to do. And so these are things that should be not only resolved quickly, and I think Senator Rest, you brought up about the follow-ups that I think the legislative auditor said we're going to do more of those, yes, which we all agree on. And so we need, and it's not an official probationary period, but we need that type of oversight to come in and make sure it's done, not 5 years from now or 10 years, because we don't have enough resources to get back to you in 5 years. But you're it. And so the overt actions we would expect from you and everybody that in that organization is then resolve these immediately, in addition to report to us voluntarily, especially the members of this commission, what we're done, to not have to waste our legislative auditor staff. Because that builds confidence in what is it and how are we serving the people that you're created to do. So those are the concerns I have. And I don't have any specific question, but it's just a request that all of us, we get really frustrated because we didn't have time to go in and measure the performance of the agencies, the product that you're delivering, those are real concerns. So we need comfort that you're taking care of the basics well. So thank you.
Superintendent Wilding, any comments? Thanks.
I completely agree that our documentation, we are following procedures. It's the documentation system that we're working on to improve. Definitely the submission of a report to you as soon as we complete all of our changes. There's many things that we have already done. There's a little bit more cleanup in some of the findings. But most of those at this point in the month, next couple months, we will analyze those and take care of those as soon as possible.
Thank you, Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Superintendent, for being present. And I did glance through the response to the audit in writing at the back of the document. And I appreciate that in each of the findings, the Minnesota State Academies accepts the findings and will comply with the recommendations. So that's encouraging. One specific matter, quite minor, obviously, but speaks to, just the standard auditing and standard practices that represent Senator Coran mentioned, and that's the finding of personal travel. Do you agree that the trip in question was personal or partially personal in nature, and will you be reimbursing the institution for your travel?
Superintendent Wilding.
The meal portion was a bit confusing, and yes, we will be paying back that component. Originally, that trip was for one conference and one board meeting. When that completed, I was supposed to take a vacation. That is true. It did come up that there was another training that occurred in Connecticut, and I had to give up my vacation, fly out to Connecticut for that leadership training, and then come back. So that is the question about the return flight to Utah. And we didn't interpret it the same way as the legislative auditors, but we will be paying that back for the meal component, definitely. That is not a problem. We were working with our payroll and making sure that we improve our documentation.
Thank you, Senator Dibble.
Thank you. And then I have a separate question, not necessarily related to the audit, but asking on behalf of the public who is listening. I think everyone's ears pricked up when we heard that there are 190 employees of the academies with 130 students. I'm sure there's a good reason, but I'm sure people are going to wonder why so many employees relative to the student ratio.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Oh,
Okay.
if you could-
Would you
Oh,
like?
yep.
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
Sure.
Superintendent.
It is, we are a 24/7 school, which means that we have some people that work during the day shift. We have students in classes, teachers, paras, custodians. We also have a second shift of people who work in the dorms into the evenings, after school programming, coaches, supervision of those dorms, and administrators that work in the evening, as well as our second shift cafeteria and maintenance. Then we also do have overnight to make sure that our kids are safe and secure and chaperone the dorm areas. There's more shifts of people than just a normal public school. Normal public school is 8 to 3 and they go home. We have to keep kids 24/7. So we do have more staff in that comparison. We also are a special ed school, special education school. So we support kids that require also speech, occupational therapy, physical therapy, psychological services, orientation and mobility. There's much more supports that are given to our students than a normal public school. And by federal law, under the IEP services, our students have those individual education plans. So there's more staff that are required. 190, we're a little bit less at this point, but we are growing. Our student numbers have increased. That number on the screen that you had seen was an older number. We did reduce after the COVID pandemic, but we are seeing new enrollments. Last year, we had a total of almost 40 new students enroll. It was 34. And at this time, we are up to 22 new enrollments for this school year. So we are getting back to our normal numbers as we are past the pandemic. So both of our campuses are growing in students. We're doing different strategies as well to expand our services and reaching out to more students throughout the state. You will see that in our budget request as we move to the legislative session, we have online academy, we have a day treatment program, we have an outreach department that also supports evaluations to school districts in the state. So our staff and our funding is used wisely to support more students throughout a statewide.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, we'll bring it back. Thank you. Thank you, Superintendent Wildling and Director Miller for your discussion.
Thank you.
Any
for
other
your
questions?
time. And
Any other
just to
questions
reemphasize,
or-
We will be
or-
making those changes. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. All right, we'll move on to our second item. It's a presentation of the Information Technology Performance Audit. It says MMB, Enterprise Performance Management, Data Warehouse Integrity Controls. And to present is Deputy Auditor Lori Lyson and IT Director in the Financial Audit Division, Mark Matheson. Thank you. Deputy Director.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So now we're going to shift gears and we're doing another performance audit, but this time it's on information technology and it's a much narrower scope. This is Minnesota Management and Budget, and in partnership with Minute, they have developed and maintain a data warehouse. And what this data warehouse is it takes information from other systems, mainly the state's accounting system and the state's payroll system, and it brings it together in this centralized data warehouse. And then state entities are able to use that centralized data to do things like data analytics and financial reporting. So here in this audit, we have a much different conclusion in that Minnesota Management and Budget and Minute had adequate internal controls to ensure the accuracy of the transfer of that data, and then also to prevent the unauthorized changes to the data. But we did identify 3 findings in the areas of risk assessments, access, and scanning for vulnerabilities. So I'll turn the presentation over to Mr. Matheson, who will walk us through the audit and the report in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Matheson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Commission members. For the record, I am Mark Matheson, the Information Technology Audit Director with the Minnesota Office of the Legislative Auditors. As Ms. Lyson indicated, I'm here today to provide a brief overview and answer any questions you may have about our most recent information technology audit on Minnesota Management and Budget's data warehouse known as the Enterprise Performance Management Data Warehouse. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize our IT auditors that contributed to this audit. They included Ms. Deborah Frost, Mr. Dustin Jewell, and Mr. Pang Zhang. Together with our support team and the full cooperation of Minnesota Management and Budget, or MMB, and Minnesota IT Services, Minute, we released our audit report on October 2nd of this year. As Ms. Lyson indicated, this system is jointly operated by both MMB and Minute. It was fully implemented in 2012, and at a very high level, it is a replication of much of the financial, human resource, and learning management data that exists within the statewide accounting system of SWIFT and the statewide HR system and payroll known as Semaphore. Nightly batch processes take information, extract it, transform it, and load it into these systems. Over the years, multiple tables, hundreds of tables within the warehouse contain over 4.5 billion rows of related data that state agencies and other stakeholders can access through multiple reporting tools to make information out of. We conducted this audit to look at the integrity of the system and the data to ensure that the information within the warehouse properly mirrored the data within those production systems. With state agencies using this data to monitor their government operations, perform financial analysis, and compile data, in addition to preparing state financial statements, this information needs to be accurate and complete. And as such, we needed to audit those controls. As such, our audit had three primary objectives. First, to look at those nightly batch processes and make sure that nothing's added, lost, or changed during those processes. This may include simple controls such as record counts or control totals. However, there's much more technical components behind the scenes. Second, we ensured that data maintenance synchronization controls were in place. This was to essentially look at if data changed in those source systems after it had already been loaded. We wanted to make sure the agencies had controls to identify those changes and make sure they were replicated within the data warehouse. And then finally, we wanted to make sure the data was appropriately secured so there couldn't be erroneous or inappropriate changes to that information. Our audit did focus in on security controls and batch processes between November of 2023 and March of 2024. As Ms. Lyson indicated, we felt this was a fairly clean audit. MMB and Minute had adequate controls to help ensure that the warehouse data was mirroring those production systems. We found no significant issues with the way the data was loaded or the controls to validate that integrity. Additionally, we found that the change management controls and data synchronization maintenance had sufficient processes in place. And we concluded that the general security controls were generally sufficient. However, our report did have three findings and recommendations in this area. Our first finding, identified on page 14 of the report, noted it was related to risk management. Minnesota IT Services does have a requirement for state agencies to complete regular security and risk assessments of their controls on their systems. When completed accurately, agencies look at over 200 particular controls and try to identify if those are working within their environment, being proactive. Minute's processes for this risk management helps educate and work with agency leaders to reflect what those risks are within the systems. By not completing risk assessments, which we did not find one for the warehouse being completed, the agency may not be fully aware of all their identified risks. Our second finding, found on page 16, is related to access controls. Minnesota IT requires that agencies regularly review who has access to their systems, whether those be regular system users or system accounts and administrators. While we did find that MMB and Minute had a process to regularly review the general regular users of the system, we didn't see a process to regularly validate that administrative access to certain tools that are used to the foundation for the processes for building and extracting the data and the warehouse itself were regularly reviewed and certified. By not doing this, agencies risk erroneous or stray accounts existing within the system or people having access beyond what their job duties require. While we didn't find any blatant or overly broad access into the system, we did find some access that was somewhat questionable based on best practices. And had the agency reviewed this on a regular basis, they may have identified that this access might not be needed for some of the job duties that were being performed by the technologists. Or they could have implemented appropriate technology or mitigating controls to address any particular risks with that access. Our third finding, identified on page 17, relates to vulnerability management. Many data breaches occur because bad actors take advantage of vulnerabilities or misconfigurations in the system. Recognizing this, Minute does have a requirement that all computers be scanned using special security tools to help identify these misconfigurations or vulnerabilities in a system so that security professionals can independently identify those and work with operational staff to get those fixed. While we did find most of the computers within the environment were being scanned as part on a regular basis, certain critical components of the environment were not included in these normal scans. By not doing so, it's possible that certain risks would exist within the system and the vulnerabilities to that system and may not be being properly addressed. Overall, our recommendations to both MMB and Minute were to incorporate and follow the security requirements that are defined within Minute security standards and procedures. If they couldn't, for some reason, those controls can't be followed, Minute does have a process for agencies to seek an exemption or an exception to the requirements. This way, everybody's aware of what that control gap is, why it's there, and whether the risk is going to be mitigated or accepted. And it's an agency leader that signs off on those exceptions rather than being something that was maybe accepted very early on in just processes or something that was overlooked. So with that, I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions before we bring the commissioners up? Anyone? Okay, thank you very much. So I believe Commissioner Tomes from Minute and Commissioner Campbell from MMB. And my understanding is also Assistant Commissioner Israel is coming up. Thank you. Commissioner Campbell?
For the record, I'm Erin Campbell. I'm the Commissioner at Minnesota Management and Budget. Madam Chair and Commission members, I want to thank you for the opportunity to respond to the report and to Auditor Randall and to the OLA staff. I want to thank them for their work on the report. We really appreciated their partnership throughout this process. To begin briefly with some background, the data warehouse is critical to the operation of our state government. The data warehouse stores 4.5 billion rows of historical accounting, procurement, and human resources, payroll, and learning management data. The system is used by nearly 4,000 accountants, analysts, HR practitioners, and program managers in all three branches of state government. The data warehouse is an important tool for state agencies seeking to analyze large volumes of data to support data-informed analysis and decision-making in their agencies. As the business owner of the data warehouse, I take very seriously MMB's responsibility to safeguard our statewide enterprise resource planning systems, including the data warehouse. To that end, we've welcomed the legislative auditor's IT performance audit of the data warehouse. This and other audit reports aid state agencies in our shared goal to operate state programs and services at the highest levels possible. We've welcomed the feedback provided by the OLA team, and I'm glad to share with you today that all three findings have been resolved. We are pleased that the report concluded that MMB and Minute generally had adequate and sufficient controls and processes for data validation and integrity, change management, and preventing unauthorized changed security related to the data warehouse. We also acknowledge that the legislative auditor identified some information security control weaknesses during their review. We appreciate the OLA identifying these so that we can improve our agency's operational effectiveness and risk mitigation activities related to the data warehouse. And with that, I'll turn to Commissioner Tomes.
Thank you, Commissioner Tomes.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair Anderson and members of the subcommittee. For the record, my name is Tarek Tomes, and I am the Commissioner of Minnesota IT Services and the CIO for the state of Minnesota. And really appreciate the opportunity to give a few brief remarks. Alongside our agency partners, we help ensure state IT systems securely and accurately use information to deliver services and continue to evolve to meet the needs and expectations of Minnesotans. I want to take a moment to thank the OLA for its important audit work, which supports state systems and processes to operate at the highest levels possible. We are really pleased that the OLA's audit found that Minute and MMB had controls and processes in place to verify the accuracy of the information stored in the data warehouse. We also appreciate the feedback in the audit report, which has helped us advance risk mitigation measurements in this environment even further. Information security audits, such as this one, are critical tools that organizations around the world use to mature and enhance their programs. In the past 12 months, Minute has conducted or participated in 18 audits and/or risk assessments through our internal work, partnerships with federal agencies, and use of external and private sector auditors. We have also completed or updated over 450 security plans and risk assessments. The thorough testing and review of the security of IT systems common in both the private IT industry and government is essential for identifying potential vulnerabilities and ensuring that systems are robust enough to protect sensitive information. This comprehensive work gives us a clear view of where improvements are needed, allowing us to proactively address risks and strengthen the security of state systems for the benefit of all Minnesotans. To provide additional context on our interaction with broader audits, as well as our engagement with external partners on risk assessments conducted across the executive branch, I'd like to ask Assistant Commissioner John Israel, our Chief Information Security Officer, to have an opportunity to share a few more pieces of information.
Thank you, Assistant Commissioner Israel. Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members. For the record, my name is John Israel. I am Assistant Commissioner for Minnesota IT Services and the state's Chief Information Security Officer. Appreciate the time this morning to participate and in this hearing, and just wanted to highlight just some of the comments that both Commissioner Campbell and Commissioner Thomas mentioned. From Minute's perspective, we appreciate the engagement with auditors repeatedly, both from the OLA and external perspectives. As Commissioner Thomas mentioned, we participated in approximately 18 audits and risk assessments over the last year, from OLA, from the FBI, from IRS, from Social Security Administration and other regulatory entities, as well as engagements that Minute procured through external expertise. We appreciate the findings and the opportunities that these audits bring to identify and correct gaps that may exist in system controls or in our programs, and really appreciate the opportunity to address each and every one of these. In addition to that, large-scale state systems, in accordance with state statute, complete risk assessments and external audits and assessments as well. 10 of those have been completed in the last year, just based on those requirements. And on top of that, as Commissioner Thomas mentioned, Minute's teams have conducted over 450 risk assessments and security plans for state systems in the last year. As Commissioner Thomas noted, we do take all these audit findings seriously, and we really appreciate the opportunity to identify and correct any gaps or deficiencies that are identified. It's important to note, as Director Matheson highlighted, that security is a multi-layered have multiple layers of controls. And in each of these situations, where there were gaps or where there may have been findings and gaps, there were additional layers of security controls that were in place to help identify or prevent exploitation or misuse of those vulnerabilities. But these findings are very important opportunities to kind of really ensure that those processes are refined and we're complying with the standards that are expected and are set within our agency. So really, I guess in summary, just really appreciate the opportunity to kind of to validate these controls. And I'm happy to report, as both commissioners mentioned, that all three of the findings that were presented here have been remediated. I'm glad to discuss any of those further, but otherwise I'll just pause here and sit for questions.
Thank you. Questions? Senator Cran.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Commissioner Thomas and Commissioner Campbell. Of the three findings, just so everybody understands, and maybe you can provide some clarity, The risk assessments, again, I think those are clear. That's a responsibility between the agency and oversight and the guidance that Minute provides continually. So I think that one's clear. But on the review and validate user access, roles, rights, responsibilities, and employee transition, right? That appears that that's likely the majority of MMB responsibility managed locally. Would that be a correct assumption?
Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm glad to answer that, Senator Cran. So it is a joint responsibility between the agency and Minute, but you are correct that as the system owner, MMB would has the expertise to understand which accounts should be active or not. I can speak to those numbers if that's valid for the review.
Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Israel. And I just wanted to make clear, it's great, it's been resolved. The fact that it existed and wasn't resolved, why we're here today. And then also scans vulnerabilities and all those things, you have staff assigned to MMB from a technical perspective and all housed in. So that's a joint responsibility led by who? Who's the primary lead on that particular task? Minute?
Assistant Commissioner Israel.
Yes, Senator Cran. Minute is the primary lead on vulnerability scanning.
Okay. Madam Chair.
Senator Cran.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to provide, just so people understand, when we see it, it's a dual responsibility. Well, it is globally, but each has their own defined role. They take an active oversight, hardware, infrastructure. Yep, I think that's clear on Minute, but it's not always clear to everybody who follows this, and they're not all government nerds or acronym translators out in the general public. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Any other questions? Are there any questions online? Representative Quam.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm curious if Minute has implemented nodal AI security.
Who would like Commissioner Thomas?
Can you, Madam Chair, Representative Kwan, can you repeat the question? I'm not sure I quite understood it.
Representative Quam.
Basically, it's putting a little bit of AI smart sniffing and detector for corrupt packets and Trojan packets in with the data streams. It's not as a large of an entity as you might have in some locations, but by doing it nodally, you can quarantine an area and address it and prevent, major databases from being corrupted. So I was trying to understand at what level of implementation of newer security technology Minute's been doing.
Representative,
Yeah.
Madam Chair, Representative Quam and committee members, and I'll ask Assistant Commissioner Israel to chime in. In our security practice in general, certainly with the support of the legislature over the past 5 years, we've really made significant enhancements in fortifying the various layers of defenses and making sure that we have the most robust tools and capabilities in the marketplace available. That is everything from sophisticated tools that work at the network layer, sophisticated tools that work on endpoints, sophisticated tools that work in our cloud environments, and certainly the correlation of that information and the correlation for anomalies within that information is incredibly vital to us. And so certainly robust capabilities and artificial intelligence as it relates to capabilities within these data sets to highlight and point out anomalies exist. And the layers of defenses that we have in place, everything from the physical layer, network layer, working our way up the stack to endpoints, the 50, 60,000 endpoints that the state supports, to the various authentications that happen across not just a particular line of business, but across the variety of services that exist in state government. We really have a incredibly robust and enhanced series of services that have been afforded to us with the support of the legislature's investment in making sure that we continue to evolve those layers of defenses.
Thank you, Representative Quam. Any other follow-up?
I have something for MMB.
Go ahead.
We had discussions earlier, and SWIFT was brought up, and it's, in this report referenced on page 5. My curiosity is the improving the leveraging of SWIFT and other entities for specialized activities, small entities you frequently have people with multiple hats that don't have maybe enough repetitive activities, so they get rusty and things slip through and there are mistakes. Is there a look at MMB when you review the audits come through to try and say, this is how we could leverage our, system to be able to support all of these different small entities so that they can do and focus on their part of supporting citizens, and the overhead and structure that's required to be part of the government can be done by MMB. And, yeah, I think you understand where I'm going.
Commissioner Campbell, do you have any response? Or
Um,
thoughts?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Representative Quam, I'll do my best to answer sort of broadly and not necessarily specific to SWIFT. I might ask my colleague, Assistant Commissioner Moore to speak any more specifically to the SWIFT system. But the way that MMB approaches a lot of the enterprise work that we do is by providing training, tools, resources, best practices, doing spot checks, in the HR space, we have an audit process. And so we don't have the capacity to do the work for the agency, whether it's a big or small agency, but we do try to help them make sure that they have the tools that they need. If we don't know that they're having a challenge, that presents a particular problem for us. So that might be one thing that we need to think through, is how we, on a regular basis, get better insight into what the needs of, in particular, small agencies are. But the way that we operate tends to be as, we are the, convener of best practices groups. We are providing resources, tools, trainings, and we are trying to help agencies figure out how to utilize state systems. I don't know to what extent. I think that there are instances in which individuals who work in state agencies maybe have less exposure to processes or systems, but on the whole, we would hope that there is some institutional knowledge on how those processes, systems, policies work, that they can also, be utilizing internal to their own state agencies.
Thank you. Quick, we have just a few minutes
Right,
left.
Madam
Representative
Chair.
Quam.
I wanted to touch on it so that we can offline work on that. And the other thing offline with, especially since these two entities are here, is they're sharing data from across all the agencies into one database. It'd be nice if a sector of that contained a centralized storage of flagged fraud, the investigation, the details, any results, et cetera. So multiple agencies, when they're going out and verifying who they're interacting with, can look in there and maybe flag for further activity, because we have seen multiple entities at different agencies doing fraud. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And that's an excellent point, and it's been a theme over the last year. So I just, before we wrap it up, I just want to thank you for actually fixing this already. So good job. I wish that happened in every agency. So any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen. So, all right, anything else? Anyone online have any comments? Our members? Okay, all right, well, we're adjourned, so thanks.